Okay. Okay, so it is a strange turn of events when everything comes together in these ways with the lectionary. That I mean, it's been a really hard month for people here. It's been an intolerable, unbelievable month people for people far away from us in Israel and Palestine. Um, and we're going to start talking about Joshua, which is great. Uh, and it's an opportunity to do some thinking and some uh, feeling each other, I think. Um, but it's not necessarily what's going to be for our worship this Sunday. So I'm flipping the text for our worship and actually just going to be using the Beatitudes for All Saints Day, because, well, you'll see. Um, I think this is what we need to be teaching today this week, but it isn't what we need to be worshiping this week. It's we need to be taking care of ourselves this Sunday and our frayed nerves. And if you're living anywhere close to Mililani, then an entire week of ash falling on you like snow and waking up with a sore throat every morning. We don't need we don't need more. Okay, so let's talk about this. Um, so we're going to start a new book, and let's give you some background first. Joshua is the new Moses. That's the whole point of Joshua. Throughout this presentation, I've got sources, but rather than mention them or hold and wave around books and speak too quickly for anyone to make use of that, I've actually just used covers with enough information on them so that if you want to know where some of this information is coming from, that these are useful sources. The one source that is not quoted visually here, but that I need to, of course, give credit where it's due, is my continued thanks for the lecture series that is put online by Yale Divinity School's online curriculum. So in particular, the lectures that have been given by Joel Baden, Professor Joel Baden, on the book of Joshua. Great. So that is what we need to understand. So for example, Joshua receives the blessing of Moses from God in Numbers and Deuteronomy. Joshua doesn't, the character of Joshua doesn't make his first appearance in the book of Joshua. We see Joshua in Exodus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. Don't think we see very much of, if anything, of Joshua in Leviticus, but he's there. He lives 110 years. He's got a long list of accomplishments under his belt, and it starts here, much before the book of Joshua. The book of Joshua itself is a story of conquest. Um, it starts off right after Moses has died at the very end of Deuteronomy. And then we proceed right into Joshua, the next leader of the people of Israel. And the thing that is unique to Joshua, even though he is the new Moses, Moses gave the law. Joshua executes it. Joshua behaves like Moses. So, for example, Joshua's first actions when he becomes the new commander or the new leader of Israel is to pass through the camp and gather the people, which mimics exactly what Moses did when Moses took control of the people in Exodus 19. If you replace names, it's almost indistinguishable to be able to tell Moses and Joshua apart many times. So this is the key to understanding Joshua. So you could say that, sorry, that, sorry, okay, sorry, let me go back. That Joshua acts as if Moses continues the law to give or to execute the law that Moses gave. Joshua doesn't add to the law. Joshua just makes sure that it happens. So this is the text that we have today. And it's Joshua chapter 3, verse 7 through 17. It's at the very beginning of Joshua's leadership. And it marks the moment that the Exodus ends. So it's when the people of Israel finally cross the Jordan River into the land that was given to them, that was promised to them by the text in Genesis. So I'm going to just read this for the sake of expediency, if that's okay. Yahweh Hashem said to Joshua, "Today I will begin to make you great in the eyes of all Israel, so that the children of Israel will understand that I am with you, just as I was with Moses. Tell the priests who carry the Ark of the Covenant, when you come to the edge of the Jordan's waters, wade into the middle of the Jordan itself and stand still." Joshua said to the children of Israel, "Gather close and hear the words of Yahweh your God." Joshua continued, "But by this you will know that the living God is in your midst, who at your approach will completely dispose of the Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and Jebusites. Watch what happens when the Ark of the Covenant of the Sovereign of all the earth crosses the Jordan ahead of you. When the feet of the priests carrying the Ark of Yahweh, Sovereign of all the earth, touch the waters of the Jordan, it will stop flowing. The water flowing from upstream will be restrained as if it were dammed up." So when the people set out from their encampment to cross the Jordan, the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant led them to the water. Hold on, I gotta move my screen. The Jordan was now at flood stage, for it was harvest time. But no sooner had the priests set their feet in the edge of the river, than the water upstream stopped flowing. It piled up for a great distance as far away as Adam, the town next to Zaratan. The water flowing down to the Sea of Arbat, that is the Salt Sea, was completely cut off, and the people crossed over at the spot opposite Jericho. The priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant of Yahweh stood firm on dry land in the middle of the Jordan until the entire nation had crossed the river. There's not a lot of controversy here. There's not a lot of discrimination or colonization. There's not a lot to talk about. So we're going to use this as a marker, as an event, as a symbol of a much larger story. But we're not going to really talk about this passage very much. What's really interesting that happens next in the next chapter, in chapter 7 or chapter 4, but we'll save that for another day. So, to drive the point home, this is from Exodus. So that the imagery of the Joshua chapter passage should be familiar to you. It is of people walking through water on dry ground. Yet once again, Joshua is the new Moses. Joshua also then, right after this, sets up a memorial of stones after the crossing, celebrates the Passover. They eat the produce of the land. And it's actually really at that moment, when the produce of the land is eaten for the first time, that manna stops. Manna starts at the very beginning of the Exodus, and here the manna stops falling. And that is what marks the end of the Exodus. It was pointed out I remember this from a different lecture somewhere else. The land of milk and honey sounds great, right? Like, who doesn't like milk and honey? But it actually is pretty symbolic for something. You eat milk and honey when you can't grow things. It's the symbol of the food for people who are on the move, generally for people who are refugees, for people that haven't been able to plant and harvest. So that is what is being said by a land of milk and honey. So it's just important to know. It's not just like good things that we all like to eat, sweet things. No, not at all. It's people who are being chased. That is the land of milk and honey. Anyway, symbology. So, even like there seems to be no end to which the Bible is willing to go to press its hand. So, Joshua even encounters an angel, and the angel, of course, tells Joshua to take off your sandals because you're standing on holy ground. Joshua really is the new Moses. Like, there's just nothing about that. So this is really where it's coming to. The point is, in Exodus, the whole point of Exodus is this verse, chapter 3, verse 8, which is from what we actually discussed 2 months ago at the burning bush. "I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of their land." That's Moses. It's underlined, "to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites." Sounds familiar? We just got that. But that's from Exodus. That's Joshua's job. So Moses got them out. Joshua gets them in. That's the whole point of this. Great. So that sounds great. Who doesn't want a new home? Homes are nice. Well, they come with other attachments. This land is occupied. And so the story that Joshua tells you is one of conquering and violence. And it turns out we had kind of oversold this discussion tonight with the question of, does God justify violence? As if that was going to be a controversial question. Yes, just yes. Not only does God justify violence, God commands violence. Um, and that's a really interesting thing to talk about, actually, it turns out. So the violence that is particular to Joshua, that is so startling, um, it's kind of like an opportunity. You could say, like, why are we talking about our dirty laundry as people who read the Hebrew scriptures? Um, it's the thing that you don't want to say to tell anyone who's like new to the faith. Did you know that this was in the Bible? The part where they slaughter the children, the babies, the animals, the women? Yep, that's what we're going to talk about. So it's called in Hebrew haram. It's translated as a ban. And that doesn't really do it justice because it is variously understood to be a command or response to God that takes the form of mandatory killing. So when a land is conquered, as in Joshua chapter 8, or if you want a really great chapter for this, Joshua chapter 10 has got like 5 of them back to back. Just city after city gets knocked down, and the entire population gets slaughtered, put to sword, put to sword, put to sword. Men, women, children, all put to sword. Just lists a bunch of cities. When Israel had finished killing all the inhabitants of Ai in the open wilderness where they pursued them, I mean, so they're hunting down people that are running for their lives after their city has been defeated. To the very last had fallen to the edge of the sword, all Israel returned to Ai and attacked with the edge of the sword. The total of those who fell that day, both men and women, was 12,000, all the people of Ai. Okay, so that's probably what's the text is happening. The good news, if there's any in this, is that I'm tipping my hand a little bit. We're going to get to this. It's possibly ahistorical. Okay, this is not just the Joshua thing, though. It starts back in Numbers, back in chapter 21. Israel makes a vow to the Lord and says, if you will indeed give this people into our hands, then we will utterly destroy their towns. But it's not just towns. We're not talking about like, we're going to like take the bricks from their library and knock out their windows. The Lord listened to the voice of Israel and handed over the Canaanites, and they were utterly destroyed, them and their towns. So this is about killing people as well. So the place was called Hormah. Sometimes, sometimes these killings are given a rationale, as if that matters, as if that makes it more palatable. And sometimes, like Numbers chapter 21, 23 to 24, Deuteronomy chapter 2, Deuteronomy chapter 7, and sometimes no reason is given why this is commanded. Joshua chapter 6, Joshua chapter 21, Joshua chapter 8, as here. It gets even worse. Sometimes it doesn't just end at the people. 1 Samuel chapter 15, now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. So it's not just the people. It's every living thing with breath that is put to the sword. If you take this as a historical narrative. And that's really uncomfortable because you either have to be a decent human being and say, wait, what? What just happened? This is in my religion? Or you have to say something very strange, like, God commands it. Either way, it's not something that can be ignored. But let's break it down a little bit more. And just to say, like, this book, War in the Hebrew Bible by Susan Nitted, it's A, very cheap right now as a used book, like $2, and B, very good at discussing the intricacies of the ban. It's also not terribly long, about 150 pages, and it's written at a really accessible level. Cool. Thank you, Susan. So Susan distinguishes 2 different forms of this ban, either as God's portion, a sacrifice given to God, or God's justice. And looks at the different examples of this ban. There are a lot of them. Many, 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 many stories, most of them in Joshua, not entirely, but most of them in Joshua, about vanquished people losing their lives. Under the portion part, God's sacrifice given to God. So this is the portion that belongs to God. It's as if, like, if you think about your income, that you're supposed to give 1/10 to God. That is the thing that belongs to God. It's never yours to begin with. So these lives get given back to God. By given we mean, slaughtered. So under the portion part, and if we understood this command to kill as a portion to God, it's essentially saying that killing is necessary to appease God or secure favor. These are like blood sacrifices, like something on the like Indiana Jones's order of like human sacrifice, but they happen after an event, after a city is conquered. They're commanded by God as a consequence of war. They don't initiate the war, but you have to finish the job. And in fact, when the ban is commanded by God, if you show mercy, if you grow a heart, then God's wrath is shown upon you. I know, right? This is in the Bible. But what's interesting when you think about this, God values these lives. Like there's something important about these lives. So these people that are your vanquished enemies become martyrs, because this ban as a sacrifice, it's a way of giving thanks to God. It's the same verb, harem, the same root of the verb that is in Leviticus in these temple sacrifices, is used to describe the things that become the holy of holies of your possessions in Leviticus. There's no killing, there's no ritual sacrifice of people in Leviticus. There is an Exodus though, but not in Leviticus. But here, this is not a way of getting God to do what you want by killing something before war. Though that's tested in the Bible too, that's in Judges. This is giving thanks. So, for example, in Midrash, in the commentary on the Bible that's developed in Jewish thought, Isaac is common to as almost a sacrifice, right? And then we think of Jephthah, which is that unfortunate story in Judges of the guy who promises his daughter to God as a blood sacrifice, or promises the life of the first thing that walks out of his house, which it's his house, it's going to be related to him. Unfortunately, it's his daughter, and so as a result of his victory in battle, he kills his own daughter, and is not condemned for it at all, ever. But the Midrash is that in the Passover, when God sees blood on the lintel posts above the door, lamb's blood in this case of the Passover, the reason it works is because the blood reminds God of Isaac, of Abraham's faithfulness, that Abraham was ready and willing to sacrifice his son by cutting his throat, right? And that's why God passes over houses, because the blood on the lintel reminds God that the people were faithful. That's just an aside of like an explanation for why blood on the lintel post actually does the work of saving people during the Passover, during that 10th plague, or during that plague of death in Egypt. Anyway, but okay, so the ban as a portion, the harem as a portion, it serves a purpose, and that's important to remember. That it has the odd purpose or the odd effect of validating the enemy as human, as valuable, because God desires their life. It's not a worthless sacrifice. It actually has efficacy to get God's attention. The enemy is then not the unclean other, but it's equivalent to you. It's a valuable life that God desires. And I realize that this is kind of sick. I'm not saying that we should do this, but it's interesting that it does affirm that. Sociologically, it's postulated that the whole reason that this story was made up, again, remember, it could be ahistorical, we're not saying that this happened yet, is that it has the effect of being a way to make meaning of the carnage of war, making enemies into martyrs, and making their deaths away from the divine attention. So it's a way of saying that death is not meaningless, and it's a way of dealing with the guilt of being a killer, because the ban only gets practiced by the victors, so the killers. But the other thing is it eases the guilt of the killers, but it sacrifices the grief of the bereaved. If you lose the battle, your grief it becomes a holy sacrifice unto God. And you don't get really a choice in that. The reality is killing isn't easy. Uh, I mean, I say that hypothetically, having maybe come close to not looking both ways before I take a right on a red, but that's about as close as I've ever come. Participating in mass killing, in violence, it does harm individual psyches. But the ban, this harem, does have the effect of giving purpose, of securing God's aid and victory um, against people who are outside of your kinship group. The ban must be imposed in order to win. God demands sacrifice, and God cannot be refused. It takes morality out of the choice of killing. If we offer them, we might be saved, because it's either us or them. It's a zero-sum game. So it means that group solidarity is built and that guilt is reduced, because it's better that we survive than they do. It's either us or them. But here again, remember, it's interesting that it means that the enemy is recognized as human, as worthy of God. Okay, so let's go over to the justice side. So there's another way that when we look at the scripture, like there's clearly two categories. Sometimes the ban gets talked about as God's justice, which is weird. God's justice means that the ban, the killing, is a way to root out impure, sinful forces that damage the pure and solid relationship between Israel and God. What I mean by that is it assumes that people cannot change. This sort of ban is justice, assumes that people cannot change. And because they can't change, if you're impure, if you're deviant, if you're an outsider, if you're a threat, the only solution is to kill you. And let's just be very clear about it. This type of thinking is really the opposite of the pluralistic diversity that our modern society relies on for civil order. You can't, none of this is saying that justice is killing people. Let's be very clear about that, because this is going to go on YouTube, and there are weird people on YouTube. The ban in this case, in this whole line of thought, when the ban is being talked about as justice, as when violence in Joshua is being talked about as just, that actually gets traced back to the Josiah reforms, the things that the reforms that are talked about in Second Kings, chapter 22, but that actually are responsible for the writing of the book of Deuteronomy and Joshua and Judges and 1st and 2nd Samuel. All the Deuteronomistic histories. And King Josiah discovers the Josiah reform, what that is, because we haven't talked about that really in depth, is in chapter 22, it says, Josiah realizes that great is the wrath of the Lord that is kindled against us because our ancestors did not obey the words of the book. So Josiah seeks to rid Israel of religion that is seen to be idolatrous, that is contaminating. And by rid, we don't mean like he took out the trash. We mean kill people. The strange thing about this is that there are tones of this in the self-conscious attempt of any modern political entity which sacrifices its people for the purity of its identity or its ideals. Think about that, how often that's happened in really recent history. That in order to achieve the purity of a people, death must happen. It explains this is the same mentality that drove Nazi Germany. So we can say God's justice, and that sounds great, but it's actually the operational idea behind a lot of really horrific things. There are also tones of this in democracies as well, that seek to be able to control populations. So it's not something that we should be pointing fingers very far away, different times and different people. It's something that we should be looking at in ourselves as well. Anytime we restrict the right to vote to people that we think are the in-group, that are more like us, that don't deserve, that the people that deserve a voice to be heard, that changes this, that has some tinge of this mentality as well. So Here, the ban is seen as injustice. The ban as an aspect of God's justice is seen as being a means of gaining God's favor. So it's not sacrificing defeated enemies. It's not treating people as human spoils. It's about expunging abominations. It's about the justly deserved punishment for people who are perceived to be deviant, enemies, external. This is the type of killing mentality that undergirds just war theory, because killing of this type seems commanded by God, not as a consequence, an after effect, but it's actually a means in and of itself to establish justice. This seems really abstract, right? But I said that the ban as justice as a way of ensuring purity of a group, that explains some of the ways that Arianism operated, right? It actually also justified our entry into the war as well, as the United States, because this, in terms of just war theory, this type of killing, it's to be able to exact what is the deserved punishment for a people because they are deviant. So just as Nazis thought that people who had brown hair or whatever didn't have Aryan features were deviant, we thought that their actions caused them to deserve death as well. So it's actually a lot grayer than it might seem at first. So the ban as portion, that might seem to be blood for blood's sake. But this, the ban as justice, this is blood for a just, perhaps even divinely just cause. And that just cause can sometimes be presented in scripture as being beyond human understanding. We don't see how it achieves justice, but God commands it because it does. And so people follow it. It seems arbitrary, and that's part of the problem here. Because we have to just believe that the victims, from God's perspective, deserve whatever's coming to them. This is what's seen in Joshua chapter 7 and Deuteronomy chapter 20. Deuteronomy chapter 20, if you want to read another time, it's a code for war and conquest. It explains that enemies far away are given the choice to submit and live or refuse and die. But enemies that are much closer to home, that actually live within the territory that's promised to Israel, are not given that choice. They must be killed with no living thing left. And that is described as just. Sociologically, this type of ban actually motivates and encourages war. Wars of extermination are desirable to purify the body politic of one's group, described that already, or to rid the world beyond our borders of evil and to actualize divine judgment. The ban as judgment divides between us and them, between clean and unclean, between religion and pagan, true religion and pagan, the worthy of salvation and those destined for damnation. The ban as justice makes the enemy a monster. They make them unclean. I think I see a lot of this right now, what's happening right now in Gaza. What is happening between the language that is used, the rhetoric that's used to describe Palestinians, civilians that are mixed amongst members of Hamas as being unworthy, that are being monsters, that causes them to deserve the punishment that comes to them, the death and the destruction. So this is, as much as it seems so foreign at first, like this idea that God commands us to kill people, it's such a surprise to people that that's in the Bible. The fact is, it exists in the world all around us. And part of the responsibility, the opportunity in Joshua is to understand where some of this originates, where we can trace some of these ideas to. Okay, so if that's the ban, let's talk about peace. Unfortunately, I don't have good news for you here. So what does peace look like? Isaiah chapter 2, verse 4, Micah chapter 4, verse 3, really beautiful verses, right? About plowshare or swords being beaten into plowshares, about lions and lambs lying down next to each other. That is a scene, correctly understood, that is foretelling the end of time. And for example, in Isaiah, chapter 2, verse 2, 2 verses before that really famous verse, there it's said that that is peace only at the end. The word that gets used for peace, and it's probably worth at least mentioning, is shalom. Shalom, described as peace, is a poor translation. The better translation would be something like a state of well-being, wholeness, for example. It's achieved by Israel's dominance over all nations. That's what it looks like in the Bible. Not just in military terms, but theological as well, when all other nations accept Israel's God and worldview. And that's Zechariah chapter 8, 20 to 23. Johann Pedersen writes about the Hebrew understanding that peace is not in itself the opposite of war. There are friends and there are enemies. Peace consists in the complete harmony between friends and victory in the war against enemies. So, for example, Judges chapter 8, 7 through 9, 2 Samuel chapter 19, 24, 30, 1 Kings chapter 22, 28, and then here, this little jewel, Jeremiah chapter 43, 11 through 12. God will come and strike the land of Egypt. To death he is to die. To captivity he is to be captive. To the sword he is for the sword. He will kindle a fire in all the temples of the gods of Egypt, burn them and capture them. He will wrap up the land of Egypt like a shepherd wraps up his robe, and he will go forth from there in peace. Peace is the consequence of utter destruction. Not too unfamiliar for people that are familiar with the concept of the ban. So peace is not the release from fighting enjoyed by the victor and the vanquished. It's the state of being the only one to experience the victory. That's peace in the Hebrew scriptures. So what's the difference between peace and domination? Is that the only means by which the Bible understands that we are to achieve peace? Is it death or enslavement? As Jeremiah suggests, well, there is another model as well. For example, in Judges, chapter 21, 13, and 14, a civil war has just happened amongst the different peoples of Israel. And these are the verses that deal with the reconciliation after hostilities have ceased. So then the whole congregation sent word to the Benjaminites who were at the rock of Rimmon and proclaimed peace to them. Benjamin returned at that time, and they gave them the women who had been saved alive, the women of Jabesh Gilead, but they did not suffice for them. So it doesn't work, but the attempt here is that reconciliation between Benjamin and the other tribes of Israel, genuine reconciliation, is attempted by offering their former enemies women as spoils of war. So there isn't death, is the good news, but there is a distinction here, and it's an open question whether the distinction is that there is a type of reconciliation through the exchange of war booty that's given when the conflict is within your people group, between people who are still descendants of Jacob, right? Benjaminite from one tribe to another, what happens in Judges, as opposed to between the tribe of or the people of Israel and the foreigner, what's happening in Jeremiah. So peace is achieved by conquest in Jeremiah against the foreigner, as opposed to within your family by buying peace, essentially. There's several problems here, clearly. Well, there are other models as well, gratefully. There is criticism of the excesses of war in Hosea, in 2 Kings. There is a pleading for the fair treatment of prisoners of war rather than their killing. In Genesis chapter 49, there is in the blessings of Jacob at the very end of Jacob's life, an explanation that Levi's excesses in war, that he's so violent, that explains why his descendants are given no land. And so it's a critique of excessive violence in war. Amos chapters 1 and 2, again, critiques excesses in war. But I think the what's been suggested, if we really want to actually try to understand a sort of peace that actually makes sense to us, not some kind of skim milk criticism of excess in war, but something that actually looks helpful, we'd have to go to First and Second Chronicles, which is an interesting book because it's generally skipped. It is a retelling of the history of First and Second Kings, of David's family, and it's a genuine political hit job. It fails to mention David's uh, whoring. I'm sure there's a better word for that. And so it's a way to rehabilitate David's image. But it also, interestingly, portrays David as not a warlike king. It also admits the violence of David. It also condemns the violence that did occur, David's war making, and explains that that's the reason that King David doesn't get to build the temple, that it'll be given to one of his descendants because he had killed people in war. It's a critique of war making, of violence in general. But it goes farther than that. So let me get to that in just a second. And we'll pick up a little bit more what Chronicles actually does when we start to talk about some more solutions. The truth is, though, that the Old Testament has a really difficult time explaining peace, or not the peace that we would want it to. But we do have to take it on its own terms, and part of that is to understand its historical context. So let's ask the question of, when was this written? What was the setting in which this narrative of horrible violence comes to be? Well, it's the story about the creation, the settling of the land that is called Judea, Israel, the unified kingdom. It's the place that was given, that we first see the people of Israel coming from. Remember that we discussed earlier that the Exodus didn't really happen. So it's not like the people of Israel were foreign people that came into this land. People of Israel came out of this land. But how? So the first model to explain this all is the immigration model. It's an old model. It's German in its origin. It says that Israelites originally occupied the Central Highlands and gradually extended their control of the plains. It is supported by the biblical text in Judges 1, that not Joshua 1, but Judges 1, that admits that the Canaanites were not initially driven out for their lowland cities. That happened later. It's also just not historically true. That can't be corroborated by any archaeological evidence. So that went away. The next model, the conquest model, it's not really a model in that it's just claiming that the biblical text itself is historically accurate. It's also old. It's over a century old. And it's also problematic because it turns out that conquered cities, the narrative of Joshua, they tend to leave behind a lot of archaeological evidence. Unlike the stories of Exodus and Genesis, burning bushes and trees with deadly fruit don't tend to leave behind a lot of archaeological evidence, but cities being burnt to the ground, being destroyed, that does. And the archaeological evidence fails to exist. There are throughout this area of the world these gravel mounds called tells. They're the flat bases of cities, of former cities. And so you can search through them to look for layers of previous inhabitants. For example, very famously, when the city of Troy was rediscovered, or the city that we think was the historical basis for the Aeneid and for the Iliad, they went through over 30 layers of cities. That city had been destroyed and rebuilt 30 times, and they were able to date each one of them. So that is the task of archaeologists to look at destroyed cities. There is destruction in the late Bronze Age. So that's around before 1200 BCE in Canaanite cities. But the problem is that it doesn't match the biblical account. It fits a large pattern of cities all around this area, of Turkey, of Lebanon, Syria, all the way to Babylon, to Egypt, that all, Greece even, that all had destruction right around the end of the Bronze Age. And we don't know why. It's an open question whether it was drought, climate change, volcanoes, Maybe the advent of iron weapons led to strife. We don't know, but there was a large cataclysm throughout this area in the late Bronze Age. That does not correspond to the specific pattern that's talked about in the Bible. For example, the order of conquest given in Joshua says that the conquest happens from the east to the west, that they cross over the Jordan from the east to the west to enter their land and start to attack cities there. And the text mentions specific cities, Heshbon and Dibon. And these cities are known. We know where they were located, and they have been excavated. And in the late Bronze Age, they were unoccupied. So there were no cities to be conquered there. The defeats are probably the two most famous accounts in Joshua, the defeats of Jericho and Ai. The Ai story is what we read earlier in Joshua chapter 8. Not the text for today, of course, but that other small snippet. In the late Bronze period, when this was supposed to have happened, they were unwalled. So the story about Joshua fight the Battle of Jericho and the walls came tumbling down, it's hard for that to happen if there were no walls. Doesn't fit the biblical narrative. Of the 20 sites that are mentioned in the narrative of Joshua that we can locate, that we know where they existed, only 2 show destruction in the approximate time period. But the problem is, one of them, for example, Hazor, can we see Hazor? Yes, Hazor is next to Dan up at the north of it, at north of this map, next to Lake Hula. So if you go, it's big, Hazor. So Hazor is destroyed in this time period. So that would seem to fit the Joshua narrative, except in the Joshua narrative, it's the one city that isn't destroyed. It isn't destroyed. It's still said to be standing in as of Judges chapter 4 in the next book. So the one city that does get actually destroyed is not supposed to happen. So this is not a narrative that fits the archaeological evidence. Yes, archaeology is not finished. We haven't discovered everything yet, but we have to make some judgments based on the evidence we have, right? That's what our job is, not to wish for things to be a certain way, but to actually deal with what limited knowledge we have, to see through a glass darkly. So what we've got makes the conquest model seem fictitious. And also remember also that if the Exodus model doesn't happen, then it's hard to imagine a conquest of people that didn't actually leave Egypt to come to Canaan. The important question, of course, is why would they tell this story if it didn't happen? We'll get back to that. Another model, the Agrarian Revolt model, comes about in 1962. It is definitely a period of the Vietnam War, or product of the Vietnam War period. It is an unabashedly Marxist fantasy. It's not supported by archaeology either. The peaceful infiltration model, that nomads organize themselves into a 12-tribe league based on a similar model that we have from Greece, based around the oracle at Delphi, the temple of Apollo. The problem is that there was no central shrine. So this is not a social theory that applies here, because we see the central sanctuary from the text in Joshua moving from Gilgal to Shiloh to Mizpah to Shechem. There isn't a central shrine that would have been necessary for the organization of the peaceful infiltration model. So that has fallen out of favor. The one that we think has the best chance of being actually descriptive of how this all happened is the gradual emergence. And it's not making a very strong claim, the gradual emergence. So it could possibly be true. It says that basically in the late Bronze Age, pre-1200 BCE, Canaanite culture was centered on large coastal cities, and that we can prove. At the turn of the Iron Age in 1200 BC, around 1200 BCE, small settlements gradually arose in the highlands. The highlands are where around Jerusalem and Ephraim, and Benjamin, where we know later Israelite cities would actually be centered. Because of advances in technology like the water cistern that could store water up in the hills, and terraces that made hillsides farmable. So you see a gradual settlement of the hillsides from the cities, and also pressure, because right around this time, right around the advent of the Iron Age, there are the arrival of the Philistines, foreigners that invade from the sea. They're not too different from like Vikings, for example. They come from somewhere far away, and they wreak havoc on the coast, and they drive the population inland up to the hills. for defensive positions. And what that means is that if this is what happened, then the material culture would be mostly Canaanite in origin, right? Because the same people are taking their culture with them from the Canaanite cities on the coastline. And that jives with our archaeological record, that the artifacts that we're recovering from this time period in the places that would later become things like Jerusalem, that we would later know as Israel, the artifacts are all Canaanite. They're not Egyptian in origin. They're not Transjordanian. They're not Babylonian. They show a distinctive Canaanite. There's nothing about them that seems foreign. Okay, so as we've got digging around Israel, the country, the modern country Israel, we found lots of unwalled settlements that we presume to be Israelite from the 13th to the 11th centuries, which coincides with that the first and only external mention we have of Israel in 1220 BCE. It's from an Egyptian stele that mentions that the Pharaoh conquered Israel. But again, these sites, not necessarily just Jerusalem, but these small scattered abandoned cities, unwalled cities, their material culture, their archaeology, the format, the plan of their houses, the lip of their pottery, all of these are distinctly Canaanite. They're not showing any foreign influence. So the idea that Israel was a foreign nation, they're from descended from Abraham, from Ur of the Chaldeans, or escaping from 4 generations of captivity in Egypt, they would bring some of their foreign culture with them, and we just don't see any of that. So the point of this is Joshua isn't historic. So yeah, great. And just a short detour. We're actually doing pretty well on timing. When we talk about these foreign kingdoms, it's important to realize that Israel is actually really related to all of them. The Ammonites are, that's a fun story, descended from Ben-Ami, who is Lot, Abraham's nephew's, both his son as well as his grandson at the same time. And likewise, the Moabites, yeah, that's also another weird story with Lot. They just descend from Moab, who is both Lot's son and grandson at the same time as well. The Edomites are descended from Esau, the brother of Jacob, and one of the branches of his family tree becomes the Amalekites. Rebecca, the wife of Isaac, she's from the Arameans. Moses is married to a daughter of a priest of Midian to the south, so presumably his line has Midianite blood. And of course, the Arab tribes are Ishmaelites, related as a half-brother of Isaac through Abraham. So the point being that the idea that we should be shocked that Israel is actually related to all of their surrounding, or that they show very similar cultural influences to their neighbors, is actually still there in the biblical text if we pay attention to the genealogies. Great. But then also we should realize that there is a consequence of that. And it's oftentimes the people that we're closest to, that we're most actually similar to, that we spend the most time trying to distinguish ourselves from. Think about the sheer kind of animosity and the level of kind of amazing creativity in the racist jokes that come from plantation camps between people that are actually really culturally similar to one another. Like, why do Koreans and Chinese and Japanese here in Hawaii hate each other so much and tell such horrible racial jokes? It's because they're actually really similar, and they feel more of a need to distinguish themselves. Or if we weren't to put too fine a point on that, think about another group of similar related peoples that have a similar origin story, but also spend a lot of time pointing out their differences, like Christians and Muslims and Jews, who all descend from the same Middle Eastern context and share very similar scriptures. But yet Christians have to call their testament the New Testament to distinguish it from the Old Testament. And Islam calls their scripture the Final Testament, as to give real emphasis to it. We all spend a lot of very anxious, self-conscious energy distinguishing ourselves from the people that we're closest to. And that is an important thing to understand as a cultural context for understanding why, for example, might Israel be so opposed to the Canaanites when they are very closely related to them. You know, in terms of the archaeological evidence suggests that they really are Canaanite, and the genealogical narratives suggest that they are related to everyone around them. It is not a foreign concept. We still do this today. And so maybe the need to start to write a story about a conquest of people might be one way of addressing your self-conscious anxiety about the fact that you really are the same as them. One possibility. But there's another, oh, there is another gorilla in the elephant, right? Elephant in the room. Sorry. It's called supersessionism. It's a really big, long, fancy word. It is the tendency for us to say when we encounter really difficult passages in the Old Testament, oh gosh, that's really awkward. What if we just read the New Testament instead in place of this and said, well, the New Testament talks about peace. So what if we just ignored the parts of the Old Testament that were quite violent and bloody? Well, let's remember that Matthew 10, chapter 34, Jesus does say, do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have come to bring not peace, but a sword. So, you know, to think about the entire New Testament as being peaceful, it requires a little bit more exegesis than that. But the reason that this is really a problem is because if we do that whenever we're uncomfortable with Hebrew scriptures, it means that we never take the Hebrew scriptures seriously as a whole. We're never curious about the story that they do have to tell as a whole integrated text. And the stories of a people who didn't have anything else, they didn't have a Christian scripture to be able to make sense of the things that were uncomfortable about their own story. It is the story of being able to wrestle over many, many generations with God. And we miss the richness of that if we just run to the New Testament every time we're uncomfortable with the Old. It also incorrectly identifies messianic prophecies oftentimes. That this supersessionism is this theory is responsible for a lot of the things we got wrong in the New Testament, or in the Christian Testament, sorry, that connect prophecy about Messiah to Jesus. For example, it is only because we connect certain prophecies in Isaiah to Jesus that we're forced to create and invent the story about the census that puts Jesus's parents in Bethlehem when we know that Jesus was raised in Nazareth and was never in Bethlehem at all. So it leads to factual inconsistencies that also make us look a little foolish. It also has a history of leading to anti-Semitism. And I'm not just talking about Nazis here. This supersessionism is essentially the idea behind the theory that the church replaced Israel as God's chosen people, and that the church has superseded Israel in God's importance. The church is the new Israel. The mission of the Hebrew people was completed. Their job was to get Jesus born, and once Jesus was born, God had no use for them. It's responsible, as you can imagine, that kind of language is harsh for pogroms, for behavior that has not seen Jewish people as being human, as being integral part of our own identity as Christians as well. Let's remember that the first Christians were all Jewish. The people who wrote the New Testament were all Jewish. The church leaders that started Christianity, that developed our faith and worship practices, were Jewish. The people, I alluded to this, the people that have supported this theory are not fringe people. People like Martin Luther, for example, the guy that founded Protestant Christianity, said, for such ruthless wrath of God is sufficient evidence that they, the Jewish people, assuredly have erred and gone astray. Even a child can comprehend this, for one dare not regard God as so cruel that he would punish his own people so long, so terribly, so unmercifully. Therefore, this work of wrath is proof that the Jews, surely rejected by God, are no longer his people, and neither is he any longer their God. So Luther got something wrong big time there. John Calvin, was also a supporter of this type of thinking. So was Marcion and Irenaeus, so early church fathers as well. But we have Romans, written by Paul, that speaks and says, I say then that God has cast away his, shall I say then that God has cast away his people? Certainly not. For I am also an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not cast away his people, whom he foreknew. I say then that they, Israel, have they stumbled that they should fall? Certainly not. But through their fall, to provoke them to jealousy, salvation has come to the Gentiles. Now, if their fall is riches for the world, then their failure riches for the Gentiles. How much more their fullness? For if their being cast away is the reconciling of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? So there is more to be said about this than some simple throwing away of the richness of our Hebrew scriptures and Hebrew origins of our faith. Okay, moving on. So let's talk about this timeline and the historicity again. I want to try to make the point about how what we're talking about, the historical context for these stories, how it actually helps us to understand them. This way, the timeline, the dating of the Joshua narrative happens somewhere in this time after the conquest of Babylon by Cyrus of Persia after 539, which starts the return of the people, ending the exile period. So this is called the Persian period because even though Israel has some autonomy, it's still under the auspices, under the control of the Persian Empire, which is the dominant power at this time. This is when the text of Joshua is written. And I think the important, if there's one thing to take away from this discussion, it's to understand that Joshua is written in a period immediately following a great calamity, a great violence done to these people. That it's not written when Israel is a powerful nation, able to wage war on its enemies. It's a time when Israel is trying to reconcile with the fact that they were defeated utterly in battle. So it's not a time to tell story or to get ready for war, to enact a ban on other surrounding tribes. It's a time to defend yourself and mourn the loss of your people and to wonder, how is it that you're faithful, the God that is faithful to you allowed you to be conquered and carted off in mass, and and your culture and your temple destroyed, your culture scattered. So maybe this story of Joshua is propaganda. Maybe it's an attempt to find security, to tell stories, to tell essentially lies, to be able to reconcile with feeling very vulnerable, feeling very defeated. And if we think that sounds ridiculous, that we would lie to ourselves to be able to deal with our insecurity, think about the fact that we currently have a former president who sold a lie of victory to his followers in the face of a crushing defeat, and that they lapped it up. We can lie to ourselves when we feel very vulnerable. The modern example is political, but the ancient example is very violent. It has been suggested that because Joshua is fictional, that we don't actually have to pay attention to any of the ethical implications of describing and glorifying such violence. And that might be true if they didn't affect us today, but that simply isn't the case. So if there's any takeaway again, it's that violence begets violence. The truth that is actually in Joshua is not about the way that Israel was taken. It's that the violence of the exile caused the people to write a very violent story for themselves as well. It's that if we're going to be concerned about any lie, it's not the historicity of the story of Joshua. It's the lie that God's peace, righteous peace, that's predicated on the total destruction of your enemies, that brings actual lasting peace. Because what we see here in the book of Joshua is that a violence enacted on the people of Israel caused them to justify and to write a very, very violent lie that still has had several effects to us today. And just as proof, of course, that this peace was not lasting, there has been no long period of peace in Israel's history. After the Second Temple is built, of course, then Alexander the Great conquers Palestine in 332 BCE. Roman Empire conquers Jerusalem again in 63 BCE. And then outside of the scope of the Hebrew scriptures, but certainly within the importance of the Jewish people, is the destruction of the temple that happens in the Common Era in about 70 AD. So repeated destructions. There is no period of independence or peace ever again. Certainly not today. Okay. So that brings us to today. What has Joshua done for us? The establishment of the State of Israel started beginning in 1948, well, actually beginning in the Balfour Declaration in 1917, has been cast as the completion of the promise to Israel of God's promise in Genesis of this land. It's problematic because it's a modern retelling of the biblical Joshua narrative as if it was historic. It gives to people a divine entitlement to land. It describes certain people as legitimate heirs, and the people that were living in Palestine in 1917, it casts them as wicked natives who need to be replaced because they are of a different religion, of a different people, of a different ethnicity, and it justifies their displacement, and their cleansing. It describes native deities, in this case, Palestinian Christians and Arabs, Muslims, as having less right to the land because of the religious alliance. This is a quotation. It's almost so horrific that it doesn't seem like it's true, but it's actually from Moshe Dayan, who is an Israeli general writing right after the 1967 war in his book, Living with the Bible. It says, "We are the biblical generation of the settlement following the Joshua conquest, and the helmet and sword are essential requirements. There will be no life for our children unless we dig shelters, and without the barbed wire fence and the machine gun, we shall be unable to build a home, plant a tree, pave a road, and drill for water." So it's not some conspiracy theory, harebrained, liberal propaganda to say that the Joshua narrative has had real world consequences today. In 1958, David Ben-Gurion gathered together a study group of soldiers, politicians, generals, biblical scholars, and biblical archaeologists to read and interpret specifically the book of Joshua to justify the settler colonial project. And that has been responsible for the carving up of Palestine today. So what's happening today? Not modern, like today. Today, November 2nd, 2023, 4 schools were attacked with 24 fatalities. In Gaza, 5 bakeries were attacked. 300,000 Palestinian civilians are currently encircled by Israeli forces from the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, in Gaza City, preventing them from escaping. Of the 35 hospitals in Gaza, 16 of them are closed, including the only hospital that provides cancer treatment, mostly because they have run out of energy supplies, so they have no fuel for their generators. Which means that the 102 truckloads of supplies that came in today through the Rafah crossing, the fact that none of them contained any fuel, because fuel is still prohibited from crossing over by order of the Prime Minister of Israel's office, it makes it even more significant. It's not just about building bombs for Hamas, it's about providing essential medical care. To date, there have been 1,400 Israeli deaths, most of them civilians, mostly close to the October 7th attacks. There have been only 20 Israeli soldiers' deaths this past week. There are 240 hostages still outstanding. There have been 9,061 Palestinian civilian deaths. Of those, 3,760 of them are children, and 7,695 more children have been injured as of today. Today, speaking at Capitol Hill, our newly elected Speaker of the House, Johnson, said that Republicans have been leading the charge to support our cherished friend, referring to Israel. He said, quote, "I've heard Democrats suggest that there needs to be a ceasefire. Let us be clear," he added. "There was a ceasefire. It was before October 7th, and Hamas broke it, and Israel suffered unspeakable acts of evil." He went on to say, quote, "Israel doesn't need a ceasefire. Israel needs its allies to cease with the politics and deliver support now, and that's what we're doing." Reverend Graylin Scott Hagler is the pastor emeritus of Plymouth Congregational in Washington, D.C., wrote a letter this past Sunday, and he observed that any voice of moral outrage at the violence done to Israeli civilians and soldiers by Hamas is betrayed if that voice has not been historically, or rather, if that voice has been historically silent about the historic and systemic acts of dispossession and oppression by Israel against Palestinians. That includes President Biden. In fact, that includes over 90% of our current political leadership. We speak of nonviolence, and we ask at the same time that, or rather, we must at the same time observe that rebellions, resistance, violence are the tools of people whose legitimate grievances have been silenced or ignored. But rebellions don't bring about peace. Again, the one truth of this is that violence begets violence. Even Gandhi's nonviolence cannot be separated from the bloodshed of partition that followed immediately after his campaign. A quotation from President Kennedy, I think, is really important here. He wrote that those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. Let's talk about something closer to home. Joshua and the Southern colonization of the United Church of Christ. So this is Cotton Mather. He's a great guy. Look at that hair. 1663 to 1728. He was the grandson of Puritans who had emigrated from England. Lifelong Congregationalist minister in Boston at the Old North Meeting House of the Second Church in Boston. He was a winner in several fronts. He failed in his bid for the presidency of Harvard University. He played a crucial role in the prosecution of the Salem witch trials. He was a slave owner of at least 3 documented slaves. One of them, Onesimus, was a gift to him in 1706 from his congregation, which wasn't a thing that I knew you could do. In 1689, he preached a sermon entitled Soldiers, Counsel, and Comforter. The enemy, he tells the young soldiers, as they're preparing to fight the Algonquin and the Wabanaki Confederacy during King William's War. So he's talking to young men that are about to go and kill a lot of indigenous peoples. He says that they are murderers and wolvish persecutors. He tells the soldiers, English settlers, that they are Israel in the wilderness, confronted by Amalek. Israel must approach the enemy with a priestly purity of body and soul. The justification is that they are Ammon, the enemy, Amalek, indigenous inhabitants who are to be displaced and disinherited by a divine decision to make way for a new Israel. It's a long story of using the conquest of Canaan to justify the destruction of people in their own homelands. Whether it be the Saracens in Arabia, whether it be Aboriginals in Australia, whether it be indigenous peoples in North America. But it didn't just happen far away. In September 29 of 1819, an ordination service was held in Goshen, Connecticut. It's not a coincidence that Goshen, Connecticut is 10 miles away from the city Canaan, Connecticut. This was the ordination service of Hiram Bingham and Asa Thurston, the first 2 missionaries to Hawaii. Recent graduates of Andover Newton, the verse used for their ordination was from Joshua, and there remaineth yet very much land to be possessed. So it's hard to imagine that wasn't on their minds somehow when the 9 later companies of missionaries, as the saying goes, came to do good but stayed to do well, possessing large amounts of the state of Hawaii. When the mission to Hawaii was winding down to compensate missionaries, we know that 560 acres of land was given to each missionary as compensation from the crown. Some of this fortune, for some of them, became the nuclei of ventures like the ones founded by Samuel Northrop Castle, who managed the financial affairs for the mission to Hawaii, and Amos Starr Cook, who served as an educational missionary and founded the Royal School in downtown. So can you guess what their business was called? Samuel Northrop Castle and Amos Starr Cook. That was Castle and Cook. Cook also founded the Haiku sugar plantation in Maui in 1858, which would later become Alexander and Baldwin. Elias Bond, who was in the Ninth Company of Missionaries, would go on to found the Kohala sugar plantation on the Big Island, which was locally known as the Missionary Sugar Plantation. There's an often repeated myth that the missionaries were pure in intention and that it was their children who would later attend Punahou and then enrich themselves and overthrow the monarchy. This simply isn't true. Missionaries themselves were guilty in some ways to the same excess that their children were as well. One of the quotations from that sermon: as the land of Canaan belonged to Israel in virtue of a divine grant, so does the world belong to the church. And as God's chosen people, the church had still much to do before they could come into full and quiet possession of the land. So has the church a great work to accomplish in subduing the world to the obedience of Christ, that immense regions of the earth which belong to the church are still unsubdued, that the ultimate conquest and possession of all these is certainty, that although the excellency of the power is of God, this great work is to be accomplished by human instrumentality. So just like Palestine, that map on the first slide, we see the disappearance of Palestine. This is the current state of land that is actually under the sovereign control of First Nation people in the United States as well. So what do we do? What we have in the Hebrew scriptures is a story of non-participation. It's maybe not the strong non-violence that we want, but it's still a really interesting thing for us to think about. Going back to Chronicles, we see an evolution away from the bloodthirst, the direct command for people to go out into the battlefield and either kill and fight on behalf of a just war or to vanquish enemies after they are defeated. We have a king, Jehoshaphat, dear Jehoshaphat, sort of an idiot, and faces a foreign crowd utterly defenseless. Judah is about to be wiped off the face of the earth. And instead of fighting, 2 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 3, Jehoshaphat was scared and gave himself over to seek out the Lord. Goes on to say that Jehoshaphat says, we have no strength before this great multitude that comes against us, and we do not know what we will do, but our eyes are on you, you meaning God. The story that Chronicle tells about how people are to face violence is filled uniquely with miracles. Stories of weak human beings, weak leaders, weak armies. Armies are divided and only a portion sent out to fight, to emphasize their complete inability to conquer on their own behalf and their complete reliance on God. In fact, God becomes the leader of war. God is the guarantor of victory. God is actually the one that does the fighting in the stories told by 2 Chronicles. So it gives the people, the human actors, the ability to not participate in their own victories. It's a theology that suggests that faith and repentance are our proper orientation toward God, not killing and not violence. So Jehoshaphat goes on to say, in an elaborate prayer, that the enemy can only succeed if Israel has been faithful to God. But if Israel atones, then God will stop the enemy. So in addition to prayer, Jehoshaphat goes on a campaign of fasting, which, was a horrible idea if you're about to go into battle. It only makes your body weaker. But that weakness emphasizes its non-participation in battle, and that he is entirely dependent on God for forgiveness and for salvation. This is a story that's also later developed in Ezra chapter 9, Nehemiah chapter 9. The story is one that the evolution is that Yahweh is the destroyer, not human beings. So this is not nonviolent, right? Because Yahweh is still the destroyer, but it does begin to form a narrative of non-participation in violence, because Yahweh is the one that assures victory. Not just as a Yahweh supports us or Yahweh will make sure that our hands are victorious, but that Yahweh's self, God's self, is the one who is victorious. That the 300 that go into battle could not possibly be the ones that are victorious. It is only by Yahweh's hand that victory is guaranteed, and that the correct responsibility is not to be mighty, to be violent. The correct response is to be penitential and to be faithful to God. This is the last of things, just to conclude. What we've done here at the Giving Circle is that we've decided to be a just peace church. It's a commitment that we made that is controversial because it doesn't sit well with some people. This is a statement that's available on our website, so I'm not sure that reading it right now is the best use of our time. But it's a place for us to discuss what our commitments are, what we think the proper role of our faith and our God is as we consider the ways that we relate to other human beings in relationships of power and coercion and violence. At the Giving Circle, we reject those ideas. And we reject them not just in words, but with commitments. So these are the commitments that we've made to each other about how we will treat each other as church members, as well as how we will interact with the larger world around us. Rooted in our commitment to being a church that rejects the ideas of just war and that believes that nonviolence is our way, the only way for us to achieve peace. So that's where we're going to end tonight. That is Joshua.